Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for Broadband Deployment News. Today's topic, the notice of funding opportunity for all of the broadband funds that are coming, is expected next week, next Friday, a week from today. I'll be right back. Thanks for joining me for Broadband Deployment News. As I mentioned, we are anticipating that we would be seeing the notice of funding opportunity from the NTIA for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment portions of the program, as well as maybe other portions of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act next Friday. So Alan Davidson, who is the Assistant Secretary over the NTIA, has come out just in the last few days and said they are expecting that on the 13th, which is next Friday. Originally, it was supposed to be 180 days from the date that the bill was signed into law, which would have put it, I think, at like May 15th, which would have been a Sunday. And they were saying they were shooting for the 16th, but now it looks like they've pulled that into the Friday. So that'll be interesting to see if it's at the end of the day or whatever. So, but I thought what I'd do is go through the actual text of the bill and talk a little bit about the NOFO and what we know about it at this point. Now, this is going to be, there's a lot of leeway here in what the NTIA can put out in this notice of funding opportunity. A lot of it says, the discretion of the secretary, that kind of language as far as changes they can make or things they can include. But so this is directly from the text of the bill. Here you see initial program deployment and planning notice of fundings opportunity. So the process not later than 180 days. And then again, that was going to hit it at May 15th. So we're looking at May 13th. Issue of notice of funding opportunity for the program that notifies eligible entities. And eligible entities for this program would be states primarily, as far as talking about who's going to get most of this money. That would be the states and territories. So every state is going to get money, and then the territories are going to get money. That would be like Guam and Mariana Islands, and I can't remember all of the territories, but they'll be split as well on the funds that they will get. You see here the amount of the minimum initial allocation to each eligible entity will be, they'll be notified of that, although that we know as well is going to be supposed to be $100 million. So each state is going to get $100 million, and the territories are going to get $100 million as their initial allocation. And then some states, probably most states, will get some amount above that once the broadband maps are in place and we can determine the number of unserved locations in each state and territory. Then they'll get an additional percentage on top of that. And I would imagine every state, Alan Davidson did say, he was joking about Rhode Island because the head of Commerce, Chairman Raimondo, said that she was the governor of Rhode Island, and he was saying that because she's the governor of Rhode Island that they might only get $100 million. But actually he was being serious. He said, well, really, that's in the bill, and there's not a lot of unserved locations in Rhode Island, so it could be that they really only get $100 million to do this. And then other states, you look at other states, they're going to be have many more unserved areas with, could be farm areas, the kind of flyover states, could be Alaska. They're going to get more money because they've got more unserved locations to cover. So the initial allocation is $100 million. It says invites eligible entities to submit letters of intent under the subparagraph, whatever. So the next thing that happens once this NOFO comes out is the eligible entities, the states, are then supposed to submit a letter of intent that they want to participate in this, that they want to receive the funding for planning and pre-deployment activities. This letter will contain details, or the NOFO will contain details about the program, including an outline of the requirements for applications for grants under the program, which shall consist of letters of intent, initial proposals, a final proposal, the allowed uses of the grant amounts awarded under the section. So basically, people are going to get more information about how they can use this. We kind of already know, we know what the unserved and underserved definitions are and unserved locations. We know what the projects. So basically, unserved is any location that does not have at least 25 by 3 service, and then underserved is any location that does not have at least 100 by 20. And then you can create an unserved service project, which would address areas where at least 80% of the locations are unserved, and then there's underserved service projects where at least 80% of the locations are either underserved or unserved. But the whole goal at the end of this project is that everybody who is in an unserved or underserved location, that would be an address, a household, if you will, that is a broadband serviceable location, that everybody will get at least 100 by 20 in this process. So once the unserved and the underserved locations are all covered, then there's money for any anchor institution that doesn't have at least gig symmetrical service. And then from there, very possibly some overbuilding in areas where they feel there's not enough competition to bring prices down. But that's later on in the process. So for right now, they have said the immediate focus and the end goal is before any money goes to any overbuilding, every single person in the United States that's at a broadband serviceable location will have at least 100 by 20 broadband. So let's say establish process in accordance with subparagraph to provide funding and eligible entities for planning and pre-deployment activities. And actually, out of that $100 million, the initial allotment that every state and then is going to get and the territories are going to split, they can take up to 5% of that for planning activities. So they can use up to $5 million for further establishing their broadband office, or establishing if they don't have one, trying to figure out where unserved and underserved locations are, and maybe setting up some maps, those kinds of things. Hopefully a lot of that work has already been in process because the timeline's going to start moving here. So hopefully a lot of the states have already gotten into some of this stuff. Let's see here. The letter of intent, that's the letter that the state will send back. They want to participate in the program, they'll file that letter of intent. It says the Assistant Secretary may establish the form and contents required for the letter. So it might not just be a letter that says, hey, yeah, we want to participate. They may need to provide some details here, and it mentions the existing broadband program or office of the eligible entity. So hopefully they already have that set up. Activities that the program or office currently conducts. So in Georgia here, for example, the broadband office is set up. They've already distributed funds from other programs like ARPA, where they've already made, and RDOF as well. So already, well, the state didn't distribute that, but the state has already distributed funds through ARPA. So a lot of areas that were previously unserved or underserved are now covered or being covered through those programs. So there's been a lot of activity. So the state of Georgia, for example, would list that in their letter of intent about how they would continue to do this. Number of rounds of broadband deployment grants that the eligible entity has awarded, if applicable. So again, they talk about what they've done so far, whether they have an eligible entity-wide plan and goal for availability of broadband and any relevant deadlines. So these are the kinds of details that they may require in this letter of intent. And it may be a form that they fill out. So they might go to the NTIA site, and then these questions or guidelines will be in there, and they'll have to fill this out. The amount of funding that the entity has available for broadband deployment, other broadband-related activities, including data collection and local planning, and sources of that funding, including whether the funds are from the eligible entity or from the federal government under ARPA. The number of full-time employees and part-time employees of the eligible entity who will assist administering amounts received under the program and duties assigned to those employees. So again, take the state of Georgia. There's really only a couple of people right now in the state of Georgia broadband office that's doing everything. They may take some of these funds, so they may, in their letter of intent, for example, say that, hey, we need to hire X number of people more to be able to administer this, and they can take some of those planning funds to do that. Relevant contracted support and the goals of the eligible entity, the state, for the use of amounts received under the program, what they're planning on doing with it, the process that they'll use to distribute those amounts to subgrantees, like competitive bid kinds of things. The timeline for awarding the subgrants and oversight and reporting requirements that the eligible entity will impose on subgrantees. So they need to talk about how we're going to make sure that when we give funds to these eligible entities, or to these, the other eligible entities, the service providers, how we're making sure that they are reporting back to us and that they're doing what they said they would do. The identification of known barriers or challenges to developing and administering a program, to administer grants received under the program, if applicable. The identification of additional capacity needed by the eligible entity to implement requirements under this section, such as enhancing the capacity of the broadband program or office of the eligible entity by receiving technical assistance from federal government there, hiring additional employees, as I mentioned, or obtaining support from contracted entities, acquiring additional programmatic information or data, such as through surveys or asset inventories. So maybe they need to take surveys in certain areas to make sure who has service and who does not. An explanation of how the needs described in subclause 3 were identified and how funds may be used to address those needs, including target areas. So they need to go through probably in detail how they've come up with this information, details of any relevant partners, such as organizations that may inform broadband deployment and adoption planning, and any other information. And this is wide open, and this is in a lot of these requirements, any other information determined relevant by the Assistant Secretary. So I think we're going to be seeing some of the details. There have been a lot of questions that states and other entities have had as this has gone on, and they've submitted those through the process to the NTIA. And a lot of it has to do with, what do you mean by this? And we need more information on that. And I think a lot of that's going to come out in the NOFO. One example would be, what is a low-cost plan? Because one of the requirements in the Act is that anybody who's going to take money from this need to have a low-cost plan for people. What does that mean? What speed? What's the cost? And it sounds like it's going to be left up to the state, and then the state will propose that back to the NTIA. But maybe there will be more information in here if there's going to be any kinds of, let's say, limits on that. So maybe the low-cost plans can't be any more than a certain price, and maybe it's got to be at least this particular speed. There may be some guidelines there, but it seems like that's going to be left up to the state. But again, maybe we'll get more information on that. Planning funds, it mentions here again. The Assistant Secretary shall establish a process through which an eligible entity, in submitting a letter of intent, may request access to not more than 5% of the amount allocated. So again, that's $100 million that will be allocated, and they can get up to 5% or $5 million for their planning. Funding availability: if the Assistant Secretary approves a request from an eligible entity under the clause I, the Assistant Secretary shall make available to the eligible entity an amount as determined appropriate by the Assistant Secretary that is not more than 5%. So same thing there. Eligible use, and then it talks about the eligible use here. The Assistant Secretary, again, this is Alan Davidson, the Assistant Secretary, shall determine the allowable uses of amounts made under available, which shall include research and data collection, so they can get additional research to determine who's unserved and underserved. Development of a preliminary budget for pre-planning activities. Publications, outreach, and communication support. Providing technical assistance, including through workshops and events, training for employees of broadband programs or office of eligible entity, or employees of political subdivisions of the entity, and related staffing capacity or consulting, contracted support. So a lot of this, again, is related to getting all of their ducks in a row to be able to then figure out how they're going to, where the money needs to go and how they're going to distribute all of that. With respect to an office that oversees broadband programs and broadband deployment in an eligible entity, establishing, operating, or increasing the capacity of such a broadband office. So, again, increasing staff, increasing if they need more computers, those kinds of things. Then they got to do an action plan, which is even more detailed than the letter of intent, apparently. So, in general, I'm just going to say a state that receives funds from the Assistant Secretary shall submit to the Assistant Secretary a 5-year action plan, and that shall be informed by collaboration with local and regional entities. And that's something that the NTIA has stressed running up to this, that's going to be very important, and they're going to have to be very detailed on how each state has gone out and interacted with different stakeholders, basically, to determine, again, where service needs to be done, how we can make it more equitable, how we can make it more affordable, those kinds of things. So informed by collaboration with local and regional entities, investment in detail, investment priorities and associated costs, alignment of planned spending with economic development, telehealth, and related connectivity efforts. And then the requirements of the action plan here: the Assistant Secretary shall establish requirements for the 5-year action plan submitted by a state, which may include requirements, and again, it says may include, so I guess we'll find out what it definitely includes starting on Friday. But again, may include requirements to address local and regional needs in the eligible entity with respect to broadband service. Propose solutions for deployment of affordable broadband service in the state. Include localized data with respect to the deployment of broadband service in the state, including by identifying locations that should be prioritized for federal support with respect for that deployment. And again, hopefully states have already been seriously looking at this and have determined, a lot of them have been putting their maps together, their own maps, in addition to what's available through the NTIA and the FCC. They put their own maps together, and so they hopefully already have a really good idea of where these locations are. Ascertain how best to serve unserved locations in the state, whether through establishment of cooperatives or public-private partnerships. Identify the technical assistance that would be necessary to carry out the plan, and assess the amount of time it would take to build out universal broadband service in the state. So they got to get really detailed on this 5-year action plan and say, we probably, with milestones, like we plan on having X percentage of unserved locations covered by this date, and we plan on having all unserved locations or projects covered. And then you go to the underserved projects, which would be also include those locations that don't have at least 100 by 20. And then after that, there's money that they can give to, the next priority would be anchor institutions. Any anchor institutions that don't have at least a gigabit symmetrical, they can apply funds to that after unserved and underserved locations are taken care of. Notice of available amounts, invitation to submit initial and final proposals. On or after the date which the broadband data maps are made public, the Assistant Secretary, in coordination with the Commission, shall issue a notice to each eligible state that contains the estimated amount available to the state under the subsection C, and invites the state to submit an initial proposal and final proposal for a grant under this section in accordance with the paragraphs. So this map is very important, as we've been talking about. The broadband data maps need to be made public, and actually not only made public probably, but also all challenges have probably been resolved. So as far as where that is, the FCC has released a preliminary location fabric. They call it a location fabric. It's basically where service providers can start practicing uploading their data. In other words, every location where they have broadband available, they need to upload that into this broadband fabric, and that's basically the data that will produce the broadband maps. And there's a preliminary fabric out now, and the FCC is encouraging service providers to go in there and start playing with that and get used to how they need to submit this data. It's just preliminary, so once the real one comes out, they're going to need to redo all of that. But they want to make sure that service providers know they should go in there now and figure all of this out, because they've got a limited filing window, and if they don't file, there are fines. So they need to file between, I think the dates, it's June to September, I believe it was June 30th to September 1st are the dates that they file in the production broadband location fabric. And again, that's going to be where they are submitting their location data for every single serviceable location. So there will be serviceable locations in this fabric already. So those will be identified, and then the service provider needs to go in and say, yes, we serve these areas. So it's a little bit complicated. I did a video about that. I'll go ahead and post a link to that, as well as a link to this, if you wanted to look at this full text after the broadcast here. Initial proposal submission in general, after the Assistant Secretary issues the notice under paragraph 2, an eligible entity or state that wishes to receive a grant under the section shall submit an initial proposal for a grant using the online application form developed by the Assistant Secretary. That will outline their long-term objectives for deploying broadband, closing the digital divide, and enhancing economic growth and job creation, including information developed by the state as part of the action plan that they submitted, information from any comparable strategic plan otherwise developed by the state, should identify and outline steps to support local and regional broadband planning processes or ongoing efforts to deploy broadband or close the digital divide, should describe coordination with local governments along with local and regional broadband planning processes. And again, that's all the stakeholders that they should have already been in contact with at this point. Identifies existing efforts funded by the federal government or state within the jurisdiction of the eligible entity to deploy broadband and close the digital divide. So that might be, for example, any RDOF funds that are already being utilized in deploying broadband, certainly any ARPA funds that are being utilized. Includes a plan to competitively award subgrants to ensure timely deployment of broadband. So they need to make sure that they are going to determine how they're going to award this, and it really needs to be a competitive process. Identifies each unserved or underserved location under the jurisdiction of the state, each community anchor institution under the jurisdiction of the state that is eligible, that is an eligible community anchor institution. And again, that would be any anchor institution. That would be like schools, libraries, police, fire, those kinds of entities. And if they don't have at least gigabit symmetrical, then they would apply or they would be eligible. Certifies the intent of the eligible entity or the state to comply with all applicable requirements. And then local coordination. The Assistant Secretary shall establish local coordination requirements for the states to follow to the extent practicable, such as the local coordination requirements established under subclause I shall include at a minimum the opportunity for political subdivisions of an entity or state to submit plans for consideration by the state and comment on the initial proposal of the state before the initial proposal is submitted to the Assistant Secretary. So they need, again, to get stakeholder engagement and make sure that people can submit any comments or feedback. Single initial proposal. A state entity or state may submit only one initial proposal under this paragraph. So you got one shot. Corrections to the initial proposal. They may accept corrections to the initial proposal of the state after the initial proposal has been submitted. So you got one shot, but you can maybe correct it. It says it may accept corrections. Consideration of initial proposal after receipt of the proposal for a grant under this paragraph, the Assistant Secretary shall acknowledge the receipt. They'll indicate whether it's complete, determine whether use of the funds proposed in the proposal complies with the subsections, is in the public interest, effectuates the purpose of this act, which again is to make sure that every single American has broadband service of at least 100 by 20. That is the goal of this. They shall approve or disapprove the initial proposal based on determinations under that subclause, and if they approve the initial proposal under that clause, they shall make available to the eligible entity 20% of the grant funds that were allocated to the eligible entity under subsection C. I'm assuming that means after the amount that the state's going to get is determined. So that will be determined. So again, they'll get $100 million, and then once the maps are done, then the NTIA will know how many unserved locations there are in every state and how many there are across the country. And I guess that would include territories as well. And then there's a formula that will take place. So a state will get an additional amount of money based on how many unserved locations they have compared to all of the unserved locations in the United States. So there'll be a specific amount, and it sounds like they'll get 20% of the funds, I believe at that point. A higher percentage of grant funds that were allocated to the state under the subsection at the discretion of the Assistant Secretary, more discretion there. If the initial proposal is incomplete or disapproved, they'll notify the state and provide the state with an opportunity to resubmit the initial proposal. So I said you have one shot, but if it's not good and it comes back as there's some issues, you do have a chance to correct that. Consideration of resubmitted initial proposal. After receipt of a resubmitted proposal, the Assistant Secretary again shall acknowledge that they've gotten it. If it's complete, they'll determine whether the use of funds proposed, and the same thing here is whether it complies, is in the public interest, effectuates the purposes of the act of making sure everybody's covered by 100 by 20, and they shall approve or disapprove the initial proposal based on that. If the Assistant Secretary approves the initial proposal, they'll make available, same thing here, 20%, blah, blah, blah. If it's incomplete, okay, final proposal, all right. The final proposal submission after the Assistant Secretary approves the initial proposal of a state, the state can submit a final proposal for the remainder of the amount allocated. So again, that would be I guess the 80% more that they can get since they get 20% on the initial. So they can do that using the online application form that they'll develop. That will include a detailed plan. So here's more planning, allocation of grant funds for the deployment of broadband networks to serve underserved and underserved locations, align the grant funds to the state under the subsection where practicable, the use of other funds that eligible entity receives from the federal government. It's again taking into account other funds, a timeline for implementation. So a lot of this is kind of building on the initial plan. Process for oversight and accountability, description of coordination with local government sounds like very much similar to the initial plan. Let's see if there's anything else in here. Let's say an eligible entity may submit only one final proposal. So again, you've just got one final proposal, but corrections to final proposal, they may accept corrections. So it's very similar to the initial proposal. So, and then this goes on and on and on and on and on. So I won't go through any more because there's more coming on Friday, a week from today. So it'll be interesting. I'm going to, obviously, as soon as this comes out, I'll be taking a close look at this, and then I will do some broadcasts. I don't think I'm going to probably cover everything all at once, more than likely. So I'm going to look through the notice of funding opportunity for this and any others that come out on any of the programs, such as the equity portion of the program. There may be something on middle mile. There'll probably be a NOFA on middle mile, which there's $1 billion for that. It's on top of the $42.45 billion of BEAD. So I'll look at the notice of funding opportunities, and I'll start doing some daily broadcasts on the details of that, anything that's different, or just kind of reviewing these things. So thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. So this is exciting. We should be seeing this money soon. If you're not subscribed, click the little subscribe button on YouTube or on the right-hand corner of the video. And make sure you click the little bell to be notified when I'm live, and then you'll get any further updates on this. If you like the video, give me a thumbs up. I appreciate that. So I will see you next week, and then be looking forward to Friday when this comes out. Take care. Bye-bye.